Hello, and welcome again to Politics of Southeast Europe. The topic for this week is violence. We're going to try to talk about some dimensions of violence, some explanations for why large-scale violence happens. What I want to begin with is by talking, let me give you the outline. First, about the violence in the wars in the ex-Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the scale of it and some of the purpose of it, and also to give an indication why some of the conventional explanations for violence might not work. Then we're going to move to talk about some alternative explanations from political sociology, from social psychology. We're going to try to address at least a part of the question of who participates in violence. And finally, I'll be talking about some long-term consequences of violence and offer some general observations about violence. So let's begin by talking about the violence of the 1990s and some of its scale. In the wars of succession, that accompanied the breakup of the former Yugoslavia from 1991 to 1999, the principal goal of most of the parties committing violence was to force the change in the population in order to match ideologically based goals that were grounded in nationalist ideology. That is, to make the population of areas that were under the control of different military and paramilitary forces match the goals of the political projects that they set. And in doing that, a large number of victims were created. If we want to talk about fatalities, the best estimate is probably somewhere around 130,000 total fatalities, of which the largest number, around 95, 96,000, was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In all of the states where conflict happened, there was some level of forced displacement, probably at least 2 million people involved in forced displacement. And the violence that occurred as a part of the war and as a part of forced displacement also included large-scale sexual violence, especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where it's difficult to get accurate estimates of the numbers of incidents that happened, but the best estimates of the number of rapes committed as a part of organized violence against civilians in Bosnia and Herzegovina ranges between 20,000 and 50,000. So altogether, these events represented the largest scale violence to occur in Europe since the Second World War, and the first genocide, at least if we want to go by judicial definitions of genocide, to occur in Europe since the Second World War. This makes it important in the contemporary history of Europe. It may be worth pointing out that the scale of violence is smaller than conflicts that have taken part recently in other parts of the world, including recent conflicts in the Middle East, especially in Syria. One point that needs to be underlined is that in most cases, the purpose of violence was to change the ethnic structure of the population. This is especially visible in many places in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm showing here a table of the population of Visegrad before and after the war. So you see figures from 1981, from 1991, and 1997 of the ethnic composition of the population. This dramatic change in ethnic composition was one of the purposes of violence. It was one of the declared goals of the military and paramilitary forces that committed the violence, and Visegrad is not the only community that we can look at in Bosnia and Herzegovina that saw these kinds of consequences of violence. Here are similar numbers, comparison of 1991 and 1997 populations in Vlasenica. Again, what needs to be underlined here is that the purpose of violence and the result of violence was to change the ethnic structure of population, to create ethnically divided communities in places where ethnically divided communities had not existed before. Now, we get then to the largest question, which we will be able to partially answer through our presentations this week. Why does large-scale violence happen? Now, conventional answers, conventional explanations for the occurrence of violence rely on history and the existence of conflicts that go back far into history, on the emergence of crisis and responses to crisis, and on mobilization of populations to participate in violence. These conventional explanations can be found frequently. They are not all the same. They rely on different levels of analysis. They carry with them different sets of assumptions. I think it is possible in almost every instance of large-scale violence to think of instances where this logic, the mobilization through crisis of historical grievances, does not apply. It does not apply in most of the cases where we're talking about large-scale violence in the former Yugoslavia. For the most part, there were not, despite the repeated phrase, long-standing resentments or grievances or hatred. The structure of the violence does not resemble the structure of crisis, and more often populations were demobilized rather than mobilized. So we're going to have to look at alternative explanations, and I'm going to present some alternative explanations for you in the next segments of this presentation.